Hello, my name is Saba Hussein, and today I'll be talking about a chemical disaster that occurred in Seveso, Italy. To provide a brief overview, first I'll cover the purpose and objectives of this presentation. I'll go over exactly what happened in the incident and that occurred in Seveso. I'll cover details about the chemical that was involved in the accident, which is short for TCDD. Following that, I'll provide information on the zones of exposure around the areas where the disaster occurred. I'll be talking about the effects of TCDD on animals in contaminated areas. Then I'll move on to the effects in humans, particularly children and women. I'll also highlight important studies that were conducted to investigate the effects. Finally, I'll cover the long-term effects and causes of death among humans exposed to TCDD following the incident. I'll end this presentation with a summary and references. The purpose of my presentation is to answer some critical questions about the incident that occurred in Seveso. I'll go over what happened, what the effects were over time, and who was impacted, as well as what the long-term implications of the disaster have been. So what happened in Seveso, Italy? Seveso is a town in northern Italy. It's about 13 miles north of Milan. So the small town had a population of about 17,000 in the 1970s. A local chemical plant constructed many years earlier in Meadow was owned by ICMESA, which is a subsidiary of pharmaceutical giant Hoffmann La Roche. The plant was manufacturing 2,4,5-trichlorophenol, an intermediary for cosmetics and pharmaceuticals. On July 10, 1976, the chemical plant was being shut down for the weekend. The cooling mechanisms of the plant were turned off, but the temperature reached a critical level and a pressure release valve opened and emitted toxic gas from the facility. This unforeseeable accident in Seveso led to an environmental contamination of approximately 30 kilograms of TCDD over the surrounding area. This is one of the highest residential exposures to TCDD ever recorded. So what is TCDD? It is a chemical compound that stands for 2,3,7,8-tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin. You can see the chemical formula in the image on the top right. It is a colorless solid with no distinguishable odor at room temperature. TCDD is a type of dioxin, which is a common combustion byproduct and environmental contaminant found in industrial areas. Dioxin has been classified as a known human carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. It accumulates in fatty tissues and can be ingested by eating plants and animals. So I'll talk about the zones of residence and its relation to levels of exposure. Initially, there was an absence of individual biomarker-based exposure levels, so studies relied on zones of residence to classify levels of exposure. These zones were based on sampling and measurement of surface soil TCDD levels. So we can see from the map and the legend that the region with the highest surface soil TCDD levels was Zone A, and the nearby zones were divided into Zone B, Zone R, and Zone non-ABR, where soil TCDD was not detected and was considered to be an unexposed area. In Zone A, residents were evacuated from their homes, whereas in Zone B and R, they stayed in their homes but were advised not to consume locally grown produce and poultry. So TCDD initially had an effect on animals in the contaminated areas. The area experienced high animal and plant mortality, and an outbreak of animal deaths mainly among rabbits and poultry was noted. So you can see in the table above that figure 2 has rabbit mortality in 3 contaminated zones, and we can see that the mortality percentage in Zone A was the highest. Chloracne is a serious skin condition that resembles bad acne and results from high exposure to dioxin. So many of the chloracne cases occurred in children, and the distribution of cases can be seen in the graph on the right. We can see that the prevalence of chloracne cases in each contamination zone has been compared to the reference zone, which was unaffected. The highest prevalence by far was seen in Zone A, which is particularly closest to the plant, and this area was named Max, which we can see in the second bar. The proportion of chloracne cases detected in a suburb called Polo, which is in Zone R, is also important to note. So the Seveso Women's Health Study, SWHS, is the only comprehensive study to date of the health of women exposed to TCDD in Seveso. The study was initiated to examine the effects of TCDD exposure on women's health and the risk for reproductive disease, and it was started in 1996. It was a retrospective cohort study, and the women were recruited between ages 0 and 40 in 1976. They had to have had adequate stored sera collection between 1976 and 1980 and had to reside in zone A and B at the time of the incident. So you can see that the pie graphs in the table below shows the proportion of study participants recruited from both zone A and B at baseline and follow-up. And we can see that the participants recruited from for the study were from 4 different age groups, and this proportion stayed relatively the same across the different stages of the study. The overall result of the study has showed that TCDD levels were associated with decreased female mortality and has a negative impact on other reproductive factors among women in Seveso. So now we'll talk a bit about the long-term effects of TCDD exposure in humans. The graph on this page shows the causes of mortality among the population located in Seveso accident zones between 1976 and 1991. Mortality is shown through relative risk, and a relative risk that is greater than 1 means that the risk is increased in the exposed sample compared to the unexposed sample. TCDD has known to increase the risk for cancer, cardiometabolic outcomes, as well as many other outcomes. We can see the highest relative risk was among males residing in zone A, which is a high exposure zone, and this was for circulatory disease, chronic ischemic heart disease, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. In conclusion, an environmental disaster such as the one in Seveso is clearly devastating to the local population and introduce potential long-term ecological, economic, and health consequences. Seveso and its residents continue to function as a kind of living laboratory into the effects of dioxin exposure on people and animals. I'll end this presentation with a list of references that were used to compile this presentation. Thank you for listening.